This is definitely in my comfort zone as a pediatrician to be hearing about juvenile court and child welfare. And to get to the point about screening, this was before my time, but at the diagnostic clinic where I worked here in King County, there was a program to screen children in foster care for prenatal alcohol exposure histories, facial features, microcephaly, certain developmental behavioral features. And it was very successful. If you screened positive, you'd come into clinic, you'd get a full diagnostic workup. And what was interesting was there was this great fear, I think, on the part of child welfare that if we are labeling kids in care with these kind of bad news diagnoses, that it will be more difficult to find placements for them. And it turned out the opposite was true. It was a therapeutic diagnosis. And for kids that got diagnoses like fetal alcohol syndrome, it actually stabilized their placement history because they were placed in families that were able and prepared for their needs. But, yeah, that was great. But my but is that the worry I have was alluded to earlier, which is that if you identify a child with a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and there is child welfare environment, how can we help appropriately support their birth parents? So I think we'll probably hear about that next. And does this panel have a moderator? Yeah, okay, good. All right, you can take it. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So Susan was saying that the after lunch thing, being a professor, I've got to tell you the three worst times of the day are the 8:30 a.m. class, because nobody's awake, the 1 a.m. class, because carbohydrate drain is seeping in, and the last class of the day when they're going, God, will he ever shut up? Which means I try to teach the 10:30 a.m. class. The conversation, we have been really intensely aware of some of the common themes, but let me introduce my colleagues. Todd LaRochelle, you met this morning. So despite that, he's come back. But just a reminder, Todd is a justice in the Alberta Court of Justice and fetal alcohol spectrum disorder father, and also very much associated with contemplating the linkages between child welfare, criminal justice, and youth justice. Sitting next to him is Kim Spicer, who is the associate advocate. Have I got our assistant advocate, associate advocate? It's a new title, you see, so I'm stumbling here. What is it? What's the proper one? Deputy advocate. Well, I was running out of adjectives, but sure enough, I missed that one. The deputy advocate of the Office of Child and Youth Advocate in Alberta. And then one of my colleagues, Christina Tortorelli, who's also a faculty member at Mount Royal University, and has a long career as both a frontline worker and a manager, senior manager, in the child welfare system in Alberta. As we move forward, I just want to build on a theme we've been hearing. I was recently involved in a case with an 11-year-old boy, and I was asked if I would meet this boy and spend some time with this boy, and I had the opportunity to do so. And by chance, he was an Indigenous child, although that actually is only partially central to this conversation. And I read the material beforehand, and like we've heard so many times, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, and a poor IQ. How many times have we heard that story? Right? So I meet this child in a play area, and there's these big Lego things, and he starts to build a tower. Now bear in mind what I just told you about his diagnosis. He starts to build this tower. And he instructs me on structural integrity of a building and how it was so important to ensure that the sides all had integrity so that the whole of this structure could have integrity. Did that sound like a low IQ individual to you? And he got it. This was not sort of like, oh, somebody's told me this. I would ask questions. He would explain it to me. As I went on and I listened to this boy, he talked to me about his family. He talked to me about his culture. He talked to me about his friendships. He talked to me about the people that mattered to him on his nation, and he talked about the people that mattered to him in his community and his school. He had context, he had depth, he had an ability to put the story together. The one thing he didn't have was an FASD diagnosis. And I said, why doesn't he have an FASD diagnosis? Oh, well, he's not FASD. I pulled out the child welfare record and said, the mother stated, I drank throughout the pregnancy. How have we not done this assessment? Instead, we've relied upon a bunch of labels that have diminished the who he is as opposed to the who he could be. The one other thing I just want to say is, I want to go back to the issue of language. The Adult Leadership Collaborative has taught me this. Let us stop talking about people who've lived with FASD, and let us start talking about people living with FASD. As one of them said to me, you may not have noticed, I'm not dead. I'm still living. I didn't live. So, there we go. We just been taking some notes, and these are some of the notes we took that what we thought we've been hearing today. And I, being a person who will follow Pat in being able to sort of say, what does that actually say? But there's some list of some themes that we thought we heard. Human story. This isn't a diagnostic story, this is a human story. We've heard about the sustainability of programs. As we're going to talk about, no program is particularly useful that is based in the now and not in the to come. Education. Professionals don't have education, be it teachers, be it lawyers, be it social workers. My colleague over here, Dorothy Badger from the University of Calgary, and I were chatting at lunch. We're not teaching our social workers students this. We're not teaching lawyers this. We're not actually teaching police officers this. So the example that we heard from Lethbridge, this is an unusual example. So one of the things we heard is the absence of knowledge, not the absence of decisions that are being made about the person with FASD, but the absence of knowledge to inform the decisions. Advocacy. We just heard a beautiful presentation from a panel here talking about advocacy. We heard that all day. Rethinking behavior. So defiance may not be defiance. Defiance, and I love what Dan said, defiance is a mechanism for us to say, so what's going on? I remember Bruce Perry, I think it was Bruce Perry, said something to the effect of, no, maybe it was Gabor Mate, don't ask me why the addiction, or don't ask me about the addiction, ask me why the addiction. And then we heard about collaborative interprofessional practice. How many of our professions in university are teaching collaborative interprofessional practice so that a police officer knows how to talk to a social worker, who knows how to talk to a lawyer, who knows how to talk to a psychiatrist, who knows how to talk to a paramedic, who knows how to talk to a street worker, who knows how, and so on. How many people, how often does that happen? Justin said something powerful. The ability to tell your story. His story. The personal story. And then Corey, the tapestry of their normative. I don't know if you remember saying that, Corey, but it was brilliant. So we're not going to do a big presentation here. We're going to have a conversation. And I want to start with Todd. A, because he has ADHD, and I like to call on him every now and again so I know he's paying attention. Yeah. You had some thoughts, Todd.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay? Somebody said, I was sitting there and I grabbed one of those stir sticks and then it was in 100 pieces. And someone said, no kidding, ADHD all over the place. I told you that I had ADHD this morning, and most people smiled, and a lot of people laughed, and a lot of people put up their hands and said, me too. Stigma's gone, right? people have ADHD. And then I talked to a couple of people during the break. A lot of people came up to talk to me, which was really nice, and I really appreciate it. I've learned a ton today. And we talked about autism. The same people who asked some questions earlier, we talked about autism and the stigma for that. And I think, is it Mr. Dombrowski?
Dan?
Dan? Dan had mentioned that it's being destigmatized, if that's a word. And then we've got FASD, and there's that stigma there. And how do we get rid of that stigma? Because I think it's central to everything, getting rid of that stigma. And I think part of the reason why is when we're in child welfare court, people were talking earlier about diagnosis. And people were talking about the stigma where mothers don't want to be forthright about what happened during their pregnancy and so forth. I wonder why, when I tell you that when child welfare is a great organization, okay? I love it. I worked for them for 15 years. I was their lawyer, and wow, social workers, the people with their feet on the ground who go through the actual experiences, I take my hat off. But as I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, we get to that point where we're in court, and now things are conflictual, right? Now we've got that adversarial situation. And so when you're a mother faced with the prospect of losing your children, not only losing the ability to care for your children, with a lot of PGOs, permanent guardianship orders, they lose all contact with their children, potentially forever. So do you think there's a reason why they might not want to admit to any misdeed in their mind a misdeed that's going to be held against them and used to keep their children? So I get that, right? So we have to work on that. I think we have to work on making it a less adversarial system in court. The other thing that occurred to me, and my little brain's firing today because I'm hearing so many interesting things. I have a very close friend who Peter Choate also knows, who their child was involved in a terrible motor vehicle accident, suffered a very serious traumatic brain injury. And that young person and the young people that I know who have FASD, the symptoms, well, we'll call them symptoms, the behaviors were almost identical, accounting for the fact that these are different people and everyone's different, right? But a lot of the behaviors were very similar. And I think people are treated differently because with a traumatic brain injury, we know person X before the injury, and they were wonderful and kind and smart and destined for the stars. And then this terrible injury came in, and now, unfortunately, we have this other person. And those poor FASD kids, we never got to know them before the injury, right? They're just, to a lot of people out there, they're just summarized as the injury. Behavior problems, developmental delays, et cetera, et cetera. They're characterized by the injury. So wouldn't it be nice if we could get society to look past the injury and see the person, right? And accept that they were injured. And that we have to give them special accommodation. We have to take special steps. We have to treat them differently than we treat everybody else, and all the way up, from birth to hopefully parenthood and beyond. We have to treat them specially. Let's see the person, not the disability. That's something that occurred to me. And the last thing was, I mentioned this morning, with respect to my child, that we didn't get an FAS assessment done. And in Calgary at the time, there was only one agency or outfit that did that. It was attached to a hospital. We did, however, get lots of educational assessments done, 3, I think. And that helped us to work, and my child changed schools numerous times until finally a private school, and then a school in another province that dealt specifically with kids with that injury. I'm going to call it injury from now on. But the educational assessments don't diagnose. They're done by psychologists. And psychologists, they know. When they're doing the assessment, they're educated. They know what they're dealing with, but they don't have the power to diagnose and say, this is a child with FASD. They just talk about the deficits, the disabilities, and the strengths and the weaknesses and everything else. So those educational assessments are helpful, but they don't really tell you what we're dealing with. And the final thing is, again, Dan, I don't know if Dan's still here, but Dan had said, look, with autism you get these celebrities who will come and talk and so forth, but with FASD you don't get anybody. Well, I'm not a celebrity by any stretch, but if anyone wants me to come and talk and I can help any organization, I'll be there. So that's all.
One of the other themes that we wanted to talk about is that systems tend to be focused on the issue immediately in front of them. And so we end up with the now question. What do we have to do now, as opposed to what do we have to do longitudinally? So I thought I might turn to my colleague, Chris, and let's chat a little bit about this notion of the longitudinal.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I have worked in the child protection system in Alberta for, well over 2 decades. And spent a lot of my time also in the court system. Did a lot of interdisciplinary work, working with the health system and education. And I guess from my vantage point, this is a problem that spans across every one of those systems. People come into the emergency department and it's a structured, episodic assessment process. People come into the court system, there's a purpose, there's a pathway, and it's structured. Similarly with risk to children, a call to child welfare, child protection results in a structured process. And so we're stuck in these silos that are all different also. So multiple assessments are happening. Many of these folks are involved in multiple systems at the same time. And so they're getting this very episodic approach in this structured way over and over and over again.
I think the piece that goes with it as well, how many times do they have to tell the story?
Well, exactly. And I think to add to that, do they actually get to tell their story? And I think that's something that we've been contemplating a lot, you and I, in our work. And what does that mean? Does the structure of the system actually allow for the telling of a person's story? Or is it about filling in the boxes in that process that's structured? So I think this is an area that, that longitudinal story needs to be advocated for in every way that we can. And I think about an example in child welfare. I worked with a foster family who, by and large, looked after children with an FASD diagnosis, and they were struggling. And the system put in some funds to pay for housekeeping and extra respite care and to give them some support. And then one day I get a call from the foster parent who said, "You won't believe what happened. They took it away." And the answer about taking it away was, "But they're doing better." And how often do we hear that, right? That again, that system structure is about time frames and budgets and not about this life course support that someone needs from beginning to end.
So, I don't know the numbers in the United States, but I know the numbers in Canada. How much, on average, across Canada, would you imagine that we spend to keep one child in foster care a year? The answer is approximately $50,000. Let that sink in for a minute. $50,000. But, to Chris's point, we can't fund the service. Kim, you get to look at a lot of the mistakes. The Child and Youth Advocate's Office often does a lot of reviews of practice errors, but your office also does a lot of representing children, youth in the child welfare and court systems. So one of the questions is, what does the child with FASD have to prove in the systems, whether it's through the child, through a court representation or through your office representing the child or advocating for the child? What is it that the child has to prove?
That's a good question. I think it really depends on the system, and yet it doesn't. First and foremost, what we see in our work, and I have a couple of teams that do child death and serious injury reviews. Last year, for example, we looked at about 83 circumstances of young people either passing away or being seriously injured, involved with either children's services or youth justice. And what we often find foremost is that because it's a hidden disability, people really struggle to even recognize that there's an issue for kids with FASD. It's an executive functioning issue, so we see in files that people notice. They might even write down that this young person has that diagnosis, and then there'll be a note somewhere that says that they appear to understand what we're doing, and so they sort of just carry on like they're completely functional. And we've heard that today, where people have talked about asking a young person a question, and they somewhat give an answer, and the professional goes, okay, and then moves on, and doesn't really recognize that young person doesn't fully understand, and or is masking the disability as best that they can, because they're trying their best to present that they can do everything during their day, because who doesn't want to be able to make all their decisions and do what they need to in their day. And so I think young people try every day to prove that they can manage things, and professionals around them struggle to recognize where those boundaries are and how to help young people have a voice and choices where it makes sense, and still also have some support where they need to think through some of the decisions being made about them, depending on what system they're in.
So then let's just look at an example here. This is just one of the things that I think we've also been hearing about today, is the notion of what compounds upon compounds, compounds upon compounds. You get the idea, right? Okay, apparently my tongue is stopping to work. I have students who say that those are the best moments in class, because then we don't have to figure out what you're saying. But we think about, and this is just an example that Chris and I put together and we talked about, and I think, Todd, you see this in court too, is the social nature compounds with the diagnosis, compounds with family history, compounds with intergenerational trauma, compounds with educational disadvantage, compounds with the lack of access to social determinants of health. And so the story is almost always, it's about more than just the FASD. We've heard the reference to the stigma, but there's stigma all over the place here. And as I say, we've just taken an example from the Indigenous community. What are we meant to do with this compounding stigma? I mean, Todd, you see this in court. Kim, you see these in the death reports. Chris, what are we meant to do when we see that, oh, it's actually an FASD problem, as opposed to actually it's a problem in which FASD is connected to compounding other factors in the life of the person? Some thoughts?
I can start. I was struck by the conversation around the interprofessional practice today, and it's a place that I 1,000% believe in, but it's so hard to do because it's often off the side of people's desks. And so when I think about, and you know, Todd, maybe you want to jump in on this, but I think about specialized courts, and I think about the family violence court that we had in Calgary, and how there is space for the different disciplines to come together there and put together a plan and put that before the court.
Domestic violence?
Mm-hmm. More of that type of work seems to me to be, you know, where there might be some magic, if you will, but not just at that level of court. And I certainly hear we don't want these young people to get to that place. And so how do we embed that in having case management functions around interprofessional practice in the education system, in the health system, in the child welfare system? And, you know, it's interesting also, I think, at least in Alberta, there are some medical case managers embedded in the health system that do some amazing work around families with cancer, in oncology, in bone and joint disorders. But that doesn't exist in the same way for these complex situations that so need that kind of wraparound case management support.
The microphone, Todd.
Pardon me?
The microphone.
Sorry, then people hear what I have to say. There's more than a few judges here and justices here. I've heard it said by people, other judges and justices who I respect. I've heard two different trains of thought, and the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. I've heard judges say, look, it's black letter law. We do law. And then there's judges like me who say, we also do social work. It's part and parcel of the courts that I sit in. And I think that's what you need. You have to have that collaborative, we'll do social work, right? We'll help. What do we need to do to help? Hear from the social worker, hear from the doctor, let's get together. We have JDRs, judicial dispute resolution. So one of the justices this morning mentioned mediation. We do mediation. We do mediation in family court. Judges do, like I sit as the mediator in family court, and we do it in child welfare court. We don't do it in criminal court, and the reason why is because there's such power imbalance in criminal court, right? Criminal court is very different from the other two courts for a lot of reasons, but one is the power. But there's also the sense of that power imbalance in child welfare court, because the director has obviously a ton of resources and the parents generally do not, so we try to account for that. So there are, I think there's a movement towards more collaborative ways to try to resolve these problems. And maybe just getting back to something I said earlier, I think we need to get rid of the notion of culpability around FASD. I think we have to. Thank you. We can't, it's not about finding someone guilty. That's criminal court, and we don't find people guilty of drinking while they're pregnant. They don't. In my mind, maybe I'm speaking generally, and maybe I'm being overly sentimental, but I don't think anyone consumes alcohol during pregnancy with the thought, this is going to harm my child and I don't care. I think there's generally perhaps not the knowledge that this is going to harm the child. There's not the awareness that I'm pregnant. And it's an addiction for a lot of people, right? And to say to someone, well, you better stop now because you're pregnant. There you go. See you later. Come on. Let's get real, right? It takes a lot more than that to be an addiction. So why don't we start by saying you're not guilty? We have a problem, an issue. Let's fix it. Let's all get together and fix it. So that's my thought.
Kim?
I think what I would add, I'd go back to the complexity, and your slide really highlights a lot of the things that are going on when professionals and families are trying to work with someone who has FASD. And I think, like Todd, social work is my basis where I came from. I spent almost 20 years working with children's services in Alberta of my career, and all of that time either working with families or supporting staff to work with families or supporting systems to work well together. And I think complexity is tiring. And I know that all those professionals show up every day trying to do the best they can, just as families come and try to do the best they can every day. But I think one of the things to contemplate is what happens to people who are working with a young person who has FASD over time. And what we see in our file reviews that we're doing, we're looking at a young person's circumstance, is that systems and people get tired. They put things in, they work for a while, they might change them, might leave them. That young person's growing up, their issues become more complicated, more difficult, they're harder to manage, and quite honestly, when kids become teenagers, we often in Alberta see systems start to see that as a behavior and not a diagnosis. And so we'll start to see them shift from, oh, this young person has a brain injury, we need to account for that, to this young person is not listening, we're going to try a harm reduction approach, we're going to try a reward approach, we're going to try all these things. And I think it is because they're tired. And so I think some of that complexity and that interpersonal work and that cross-systems work, we really need to think about how do you support professionals and families through that time when they're tired. Because I think it really does impact the services for young people as they grow up.
There's another thought, and it's, is a person with FASD allowed to go through normal developmental trajectories in terms of their social environment?
Yeah, and I think, I shake my head no. I think in our file reviews, we see them going through the normal developmental processes, but the reactions of people around them often forget some of that difference in their thinking and functioning, and so they're really looked at as problems as they age. And we see a lot of young people living on their own, living in shelters or on the street, living a harm reduction lifestyle, which in Alberta means that you're really trying to meet that young person where they're at and allow them to make choices, but maybe not considering that the executive functioning for that young person is compromised. And so we really see them at risk a lot as they age, especially Alberta supports young people to the age of 22 through the child intervention programs, so they can stay involved with some extra support. But we really see less and less hands-on at a time when young people need some strong support systems around them in order to be successful. And we know that for young adults.
And it's interesting too, we look at at research that consistently tells us that over the last decade, children are staying home and staying connected to the dependency or some level of dependency to their families longer than they used to. I mean, when I grew up, which is just after the invention of dirt, but it was like you hit 18, it was like, okay, I'm out of here, But there were lots of reasons why we could afford to actually be, I'm out of here, just to make those of you in the university feel sad. Through all of my 6 years of my first 2 degrees, my fees were $575 a year. Think about that. So in other words, there was affordable options, but someone that Chris and I both know, and I think you know as well, who runs the Child Intervention Program for the Piikani First Nation, was telling me a story that one of the things that happens is the other thing that's not taken into account in the child intervention system, where we have such overrepresentation of Indigenous people, is that if that child hasn't been maintained in contact with their culture, then around these very years, in the mid-teenage years, they go looking for their culture, and they get very confused about their culture. And I'm going to tell a quick story, which I have permission to tell, by the way, so I just want to be clear about that, about a young woman who is now a social worker, and is about to start her master's degree, actually. And she's Indigenous, and Chris knows this story. And she was from the Kainai First Nation, was in foster care, grew up in a small, in foster care in a small town in Alberta that was very, she was one of 2 Indigenous people in this town. The other Indigenous person was this other little girl. And on our Canadian National Day was July 1st, which is sort of like your July 4th. In order to represent Indigenous people, they would dress her up in an Indigenous costume, the 2 girls, and they would put them at the front of the parade, and that was their connection to culture. So in university, we're engaged in a research project, and part of it is we're interviewing some people from various nations, and there was this person from the G'day First Nation who came to one of our meetings who turned to her and said, "So what's your last name again?" And she said, "It's so-and-so." She said, "Oh, you're related to so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so." This was the first time she knew she had those relatives. Now, she doesn't have FASD, but you can imagine what that did to her search for identity. Who am I? What do you mean I have these relatives? So our friend from the County First Nation says, "I'd like you to think that that's an unusual story, but it's not. We are faced with that story often." We heard earlier today about some information in the United States about frequency, and Philip May has done some really interesting work in that. Svetlana Popova, who is going to be here at the conference, certainly also talks to us about the frequency. So the frequency runs around 4%, 4.5% in Canada, according to Svetlana's work. And I think similar numbers in the United States. Julian was, yeah. But what often gets lost in the conversation brings us back to the thought about stigma, is we forget the word spectrum. And so many of the systems, they hear the diagnosis and they're thinking about the spectrum up here. They forget there's a whole long spectrum. How often do we get into the conversation, Chris, around spectrum?
Gosh, not often, definitely not often enough. And in Alberta, we used to do a really good job of training workers, not enough, but we had an approach for training workers around FASD, how to understand the spectrum, how to work with young people, why assessment was important, how to support caregivers. But the political will to do that has shifted, and that has since fallen off. So no, we're not talking about it. And, I think, Peter, you and I both have seen where the view of the public is the small number of folks who land in front of the court, who have public stories, adults in the criminal system, families in the child welfare system. And I think this is where the work that we've been doing, looking at the court cases and what happens for adults, parents, when they become involved with child welfare and start to move through that system, that the system isn't good at understanding that there's a range of supports that are needed, and that everyone doesn't look the same. It's a problem.
So, Todd, I was looking at a decision out of Ontario, which is a bit of an unusual decision. I'm not going to. Of course, you would know it. Not. But one of the things that came out of it is that here was a mother who was performing pretty well in terms of being able to access her supports and be able to sustain her supports. And so there was a conversation about, well, maybe what should happen is the child will remain in the care of the Director of Child Welfare in Ontario, and mom can have a relationship. That's not something we see often in the court, is it?
We're seeing it a lot more. So what you're saying is the child isn't in the day-to-day care of the mother, but there's still a relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot more, and the reason why is something called kinship care. I don't know if you have kinship care, if you call it that in the United States and the other provinces, but kinship care, in my experience, I've been doing this for 30-some years, is night and day from what it was when I started, okay? And when there's kinship care, and when the child is able to remain on a long-term basis, perhaps permanent basis with kinship care, then absolutely, there's lots of room for the child. I always think it's the right of the child to have a relationship with the parent. So we're talking about children's rights. And, often, unless that parent is involved in some activity which poses a real risk to the child, then I think the more people that love a child, the more the child benefits, right? So I'm a big fan of kinship care, and I like to, whenever I have a grandparent application for guardianship, or grandparents, or brothers, sisters, cousins, I always just like to thank them. Thanks for stepping up and filling this need, and so I actually think it's much better than it used to be as far as long-term relationships go.
And is that something, Kim, that your office advocates for?
For sure. One of the, as Todd suggested, one of the rights that we would advocate for young people is the right to be connected to their family, their community, and their culture. And so we definitely work with young people on a day-to-day basis around how they can maintain those connections and have that involvement with children's services. And to his point, where kids are placed with extended family or community members, we really see that benefit. But to your point, when kids aren't placed with family, if they're placed in foster care or in group care, what we do see over time quite often is those connections to those positive people in their lives can be diminished, and then those kids can become profoundly lost and profoundly lonely. And your story for Bigani is not unique for what we often see. We've made some recommendations to government around permanency planning, which isn't a court, it is somewhat a court requirement, but it's a policy requirement and a legislative requirement in the Child Welfare Act in Alberta, that they really need to think about those permanent arrangements for kids. There definitely was a time where if a kid became a permanent ward of the province, they would have their relationships with their family severed. And we still see many of those kids in the system. They're often those older kids that we talk about, and they really drift. And yet at the same time, to Bigani's point, if you had someone fantastic like Kevin Campbell, who's from here with his family finding model, sit down with anyone who knew that community, in 5 minutes they could draw a family map of family members that could be connected to that young person.
So we have spent a bit of time talking about what the diagnosis means in court. When do we try to draw hope into the conversation? You've alluded to it, Todd, but how can we help to not have the disaster story as the script?
Well, I think a lot of people have said a lot of good things about that today. I'm going to take away. I'll mention perhaps just a corollary to your question, and that is we haven't talked at all about family court, not child welfare court, but family court, also known as divorce court, right? And I did mention earlier this morning that it's rare, if ever, that I would see an assessment of the child in that court for various reasons. But I think what I say to people in that court might apply generally, and that is when I have parents in conflict, the two parents, as you can only imagine in family court, how it can get. I'll always say to them, look, I want you to try to, let's try and work together, let's try and do, and I always say to them, look, if you're not going to work together, if you're not going to learn to compromise, then I want you to put aside $50 every month, both of you, because that's going to start paying for your child's counseling once they hit the age of 10, 11, 12, and now they need counseling from all this conflict in their life. Well, and I believe that. I believe that's true. But imagine if you've got a child who has the challenges that the kids that we are talking about have, how much more difficult that is on them to deal with all of that conflict. So getting back to what I said earlier about let's get rid of the culpability, let's get rid of the conflict. Across the board, if we can, let's try and deal with the conflict.
I think inflation is such that you better move that $50 up. Yep.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the notion of systems being reactive. We've talked about the notion that time-limited supports are a problem. So let's consider a couple of other things. What do we do, what changes when we take a skill or strength-based approach to working, in which we are able to say a child with FASD has skills? What happens if we don't engage the deficit conversation? What do you think might change? What do you think might be different?
So the first thing that I've seen when maybe that's the first time that a parent is asked about the strengths either that they have as a parent with FASD or that their child has, is they start to light up. It changes the conversation. And it starts to take away some of that stigma. So when we do that, I think we get to a better place. I think for workers in the system, frontline workers, many of them are very good at that. But I've also seen in Alberta, we have a family support for children with disabilities program. So families come forward with a diagnosis, they apply for services and are provided with a list of things like respite or like housekeeping, help with benefit plans, that kind of thing. And the challenge with that is that they have to provide the deficits to get the service. So on the side of child welfare, we understand that there's risk needs to be assessed. We can still promote coming at that from a strength-based perspective and should be. Strengths show us the way in terms of how to build things in the future, how to support that family and that child. But when we have a system that is there to provide support, and what's required is a deficit-based, my child has a diagnosis, here's all the things they can't do, I think we have to find places in those systems to start to turn that around and learn from what we've learned about having a strength-based approach, be advocates to shift those places everywhere we can. As a social worker, I think, we own that in our field to take that on, as do each of us when we're in spaces in other systems with other professionals, to be outspoken around that strength-based approach and to raise that up at tables and in conversations everywhere we can.
Okay.
For me, I think, to Chris's point, I think looking for strengths shifts the conversation, and I think some of the magic is really thinking about connections with the family, connection for that young person, and really thinking outside of the box. And in Alberta, as Chris was talking, I was thinking about the FASD program, the Supports for Children with Disabilities program, which will give parents who qualify funds to reach out and find supports, but often uses a lens of professionalism. So it's like, oh, you want respite, this person must meet these criteria. Rather than thinking about what works for that young person in that family, who do they know that they're comfortable with and that they feel supports them and really understands their situation, and that really having more of that person involved would be a benefit to that family. So I think a strength-based approach requires us to let go of some of sometimes our systems thinking around professionalizing everything and recognizing the power of connection for kids and families, and just how magic that can be to help people express the best pieces of themselves.
Yeah, one of the things that drives me crazy are the IQ-determined access to services.
Crazy.
Oh, you've got an IQ of 76. You don't actually deserve any support. Those drive me crazy. Yeah.
I just wanted to add, I think there's some small but meaningful changes in language. Things like how can we, as opposed to thinking about why we cannot.
So, we want to suggest that we step away from the typical child welfare solutions. Poorly supported pathways to adulthood are probably one of the ones that we're seeing more and more in various jurisdictions. And, you know, we've heard lots of conversation about how incarceration, probation, bail, those are systems those are solutions that systems like. They're measurable, we can put barriers around them, they're short term, and we don't have to sort of persist and be around. And we just want to finish by saying we think that there are 8 factors to consider. People with FASD are concrete, time-focused decision makers. We've heard lots about that today. Why can we not recognize that? They respond to consistent and clear messages. Why do we then send inconsistent? My eyesight is not good enough to read the next line. Am I alone in that? Yeah. Yeah. Fourth one down.
Repetition of messages matters, memory is a challenge.
Right, okay. Okay. And then we get
Help to build routines.
But use repetition.
Team effort here.
yep. Okay, carry on, because my eyesight is, you know.
Keep direction specific. Who chose these colors, Peter?
On my computer, they look just fine. Yeah,
The next
okay.
one's impossible.
It's a supervision and monitoring matters.
Yep.
Oh, and structure.
And structure. So, the idea being, by the I'm partially colorblind, so you know some of that stuff just disappears for me. It's like, you know, Pat, you might be able to identify with me on this thing. It's like, you know, I show up in class fairly frequently, and students will go, "So did your wife check your clothes today?" Why? Well, that's an interesting pairing of colors. So, Julian, I think we are just about out of time here. But any closing thoughts? Todd?
Well, I didn't get any personal, I didn't get permission to discuss anything personal, but I'm just going to say, as far as hope goes, I know of one of these young people who has this challenge, who was parented by someone with ADHD who really didn't have the skills. So I think all the credit goes to the young person who has a job, pays taxes, has a residence, has a partner, and has not had any run-ins with the law. So there's tons of hope.
Kim?
I think for me, what we see in our work and the hopefulness pieces, when we're looking at a young person's lifespan when something terrible has happened to them, is really one of the best places to create change for a young person and their family is early on. And we talked about that, not waiting till they're 50 to do an assessment, not waiting until they've lost all their positive people in their lives and can't keep up in school, but really meeting families where they're at early, and then thinking outside of the box to support them and that young person, recognizing the uniqueness of their situation makes a huge difference. That when we see that, and we do see that, because we also look at good practice and we see amazing practice, as well as some places where we have things to shore up. It is that magic. It's that coming together and really meeting that family where they're at, and that always gives me hope when I see it.
And Chris?
So, hope. I guess reiterating that we are all here today for this full day, which has been amazing. And that we all have places of influence. And so in those places of influence, how do we continue the conversation in all of those places? Support each other in that, because it is really hard, challenging work. And do what we can to build the knowledge and the right language and a strength-based approach in the next generation. So I know, Peter, you and I talk about that a lot, and how we, in training new social workers, how do we take responsibility for embedding this into their education and making it meaningful?
So I think on behalf of all of us and Kermit the Frog, thank you. Thank you for your interest in this. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the comments, the questions, the insights that we've heard over the course of the day. It is events like this that really, for me, are where the hope lies. Julian, we hand it back to you. We do have we actually have some time for questions. Oh, and I'm watching.
And I have an anecdote that
An
you and I talked about.
An anecdote.
Well, we talked about it. I just think, okay, so I know of a situation where a father caught a child with matches.
Oh yes.
Trying to steal a
Mhm.
He didn't know the story. And the parent says to the child, "Where'd you get the matches?" "I found them." "No, you didn't. It's been raining for 2 days. It's soaked. If you found the matches, they wouldn't work." "I found them." "No, I think you took the money off the counter and you bought them from that little store right there." "I did not." And so as the parent walks the child towards that store, they keep giving them, not ultimatums, but opportunities. "If you tell me now the truth, you're not going to get punished. You know how that goes." All the way to the store, right to the curb, in the store. Last chance, standing in front of the person. "Last chance. Did you buy them here?" "No." Turn to the person. "Did you buy them here?" "Yes." About 15, 20 minutes ago with some, and I think a lot of people faced with a scenario like that are going to react with, "That's outrageous." How? Bad, liar, all these terrible things about how can that kid, no, it's one of our kids. And this is what we deal with. And people don't know that out there. And I think people need to learn that out there. And again, that's what we're doing here. So, yeah, that's all.
So question here and then to there.
Thanks for the opportunity to ask the question. My name is Terry Tibbet. I live in Alaska. And I work a lot in the public advocacy arena with legislators, with professionals educating about FASD and other things. And when we're talking about stigma, I had this conversation with Susan Carlson when we were in DC, and we disagreed on how it should be approached. But I really find that the word, when you mention the word alcohol as associated with the disability, the walls go up. And I'm a real supporter of taking the word alcohol out of it. And if we can, it's prenatal brain injury, like you said, and call it prenatal brain injury, and you will have more, or something like that is what I'm saying. You will have more people jumping in there with you than putting up the wall and turning against you. And it's an automatic thing that I see in people's faces all the time. So, we hear all the time, we need to change this, we need to address stigma, we need to do this, we need to do that. And I want to make that suggestion that as an action item, that we find a way to change the way it's referred to, and take the word alcohol, and even the word fetal, because that word fetus has a real buzz in this country, and in the United States. And I find that the word fetal and the word alcohol turn people off or turn people against what you're trying to do right away. So I almost think changing the name, and we've already changed the name multiple times, but that's my suggestion. And I would love to hear your suggestions for how we address stigma, not just that we need to, but how.
I feel the tsunami of the diagnosticians coming towards me here. So I think, though, that what you're raising is, there's great debate on this issue that you're talking about. And if I was a smart and wise person, I would just toss this to Julian as a diagnostician. I'm reminded of a conversation with a researcher who did a small study in the downtown east side of Vancouver. And the goal of the research was to provide a whole bunch of different sorts of approaches. It was vitamins, it was housing, it was nutrition, and so on. And the deal was that in order to get you engaged in that, we're not going to talk to you about your alcohol consumption. We're going to talk to you about care of the child, we're going to talk to you about nutrition, we're going to talk to you about those things. And one day, one of the women pointed to one of the typical no alcohol in pregnancy ads that, shows, and there's the pregnant mother, sort of about 42 minutes away from delivering, holding a glass of wine, and says, "I'm not sure who that's for. I can't identify with the prevention messages. It doesn't make any sense to me. You're giving me the message I should look after the baby through the pregnancy, but then you show me a lady who's about to pop with a glass of wine."